Hi, everyone, and welcome to our fourth edition of Cocktails with the Curator. My name's Susan O'Sullivan, and joining me here this evening is Julie DeVere, our Director of Museum Collections and Curator. Hi, Julie.
Hi, Susan. Hi, everyone.
We are in the study this evening. Julie and I are drinking our Moscow Mules this evening, and we hope you're joining us with your cocktail or mocktail of choice. I'm in a virtual background so you can see my drink disappears. Anyway, cheers, Julie.
Cheers. The Moscow Mule is actually my go-to lazy at-home cocktail. So this was a good choice for this one, since it was an easy favorite of mine. And it was the Cold War era. So for some reason that translates into vodka being very plentiful and being like a big source of drinks in the 60s. Why that's the American response to that, I'm not quite sure, but that was why it was the most popular cocktail of the 60s. But here in the study, as I said, we really wanted this at-home moment, and my partner said, you know, you've sort of haunted your house. You know, when I showed him video when we were installing and the house was still closed, I said, well, yeah, I sent him a picture, a little video stream, and he was like, okay, so you've got like, there's Mr. Roth, Bill is making a drink in the bar, and so you hear glass and ice, and you hear him kind of singing along with the television as if it's a catchy tune in his head, and you hear a bridge game happening over here in the corner. If you listen closely, you'll hear my giggle because I win a good hand at bridge. So one of the voiceovers in there. And you know, these different speakers and things are happening throughout the room so that you get a sense of being sort of immersed in the space. And it plays in time with the television. So I know it's hard to see. It's sort of, I've been told it sort of looks like just a big glowy blowout behind you. But when I take you as a little tour, you might be able to see it when we get a little closer. We have, you know, a couple of period commercials that play on it. And then the team actually worked with our soundscape engineer to create a customized Matson commercial that plays in here, that's built from different footage that we had in the archives, as well as online footage of Matson. And you know, a lot of the Roths' interests in Hawaii, with their deep roots in Hawaii. You know, Bill Roth was born in the Kingdom of Hawaii before it was annexed and became a state. And you know, Mrs. Roth, of course, like Matson, Captain Matson, went back and forth to Hawaii when it was still a kingdom for a lot of his early shipping trade. But what a lot of people don't ever mention is that Captain Matson was an early co-founder of the Honolulu Oil Corporation, as well as oil corporations in California. So you have a lot of oil money from the very beginning going back and forth in Hawaii as well. And so his family went back and forth to Hawaii almost every year of Lurlene's life. And by the 60s, you know, unfortunately, Bill Roth passes away in 1963 at the age of 83. And as this sort of new widow, you know, Lurlene bought a large piece of property on the Big Island, and she had a beautiful estate there that was nearby a local hotel. She really kind of chose that as a spot where she could go and sort of recover herself. And she increasingly would spend less and less time here at Filoli. She officially kind of moves out around 1968. So this was a big decade of change, and I don't think that they necessarily saw that it was going to happen that way for them. They had started in the late 20s, the Hawaiian hotels, you know, the Royal Hawaiian, which was later the Moana, the Surf Rider, the Princess Kailani. Today, those historic Sheraton hotels, they sold those in 1959. So just at the end of the last decade, and they sold them for about $17.6 million. So you can kind of see it was towards the end of Bill's career. He retired just a year before, in 1962. He retired from being chairman of the board of Maps and Navigation. And he'd already been suffering small strokes But he was still working. You know, both men of this house were not going to be stopped. You know, they both sort of pushed through quite a lot. And you know, I don't think that they necessarily saw that the 60s were going to be kind of as huge a transition period for them here. And so Mrs. Roth kind of moves out and starts kind of staying both at her place in Hawaii, as well as staying with family and friends and with the kids. But you go from this very Filoli-based family time, and we're showing this as their family room. And this was the most popular place to have cocktails before you were called down the hall for dinner. You know, and this was that spot where their kids came back twice a week for family dinners. Thursday night and Sunday night, you were required to return to Filoli for family dinner. Not only her three children, you know, Lurleen and Bren and Bill, but also their spouses and their children. And so all of those grandchildren, and each one of them had 3 children. So these 9 kids all kind of came back to Filoli twice a week. And, you know, some of them lived close by in Woodside, and some of them lived in San Anselmo, a little farther away. And so, you know, they remember that very differently about what it was like to come back. And although there's those good memories of taking all the cushions off of the couches and making pony jumps and them like doing horse jumps all the way down the hallway, you also have school Friday morning that you need to be up in an hour and a half away for every week. That was a big part of their childhood, was going back and forth to Filoli. And this was a time when, you know, Bill passes away in 1963. Mrs. Roth is in her early 80s. She's about the same age as him. And she starts hosting the next generation's debut balls. You know, so like we have in the reception room, just a couple of rooms away, her, you know, granddaughters are having their debutante balls, and she's hosting them here on site. And she's working with Tony Duquette to do these amazing over-the-top parties where she spent $150,000 on decorations alone. One of her big parties ended with a brunch, and like the wee hours in the morning. You don't even start, you know, until 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and then it's going to end with a brunch bar. Instead of like a formal dinner, you have brunch. And she had them create a false sunrise with giant spotlights on the foothills right behind us in the middle of the 60s. You know, one of the parties they wanted to have, it was for Denny's party, it was for the blue and white, so it would have been Lolly's debut ball. She wanted to have this blue and white party based on blue and white, like Delftware. And the accent color was sunflowers. And so Mrs. Roth planted Tony Duquette an entire field of sunflowers for him to use. But this is a nighttime party. And what do sunflowers do at night? They look down. So there's these amazing pictures, and all the sunflowers are sort of droopy looking and looking straight down. You know, so I mean, sometimes you have these just over the top designs, tenting the front courtyard. And she's always there in like the most fashionable sheath gowns of the time period. She takes her daughters and her granddaughters on trips to go pick up French couture designer dresses to be made special for them. And both, you know, multiple granddaughters have told me, you know, what it was like to go shopping, you know, with grandmother, and they would go and be fitted for these beautiful dresses, and it was their special day. You know, there was lots of talk about like whether or not, you know, what you were going to get as gifts that year. Were you getting a horse? There's some jealousy that one grandchild got a car when others got horses. That seems to have been a little bit of competition drama between grandchildren. They were like, she got a convertible. We got horses, beautiful horses. Convertible didn't have to stay at grandma's house like the horses did. So a little bit of that back and forth. But we definitely have, you know, a big period of change in the 60s. You know, and Hawaii becomes an even maybe bigger part of Lurleen's life as she spends more and more time at the house in Hawaii. And we do have some of those pieces here in the collection that we see were in the house there. And there's little things that I think so many people do that you don't always necessarily know that they're going to do. So like when I helped my mom with some home remodeling, and then she moved about 5 years later into another house, I said, oh, well, we need to pick out like the roof tile again, and we need to pick out the paint color, and we need to do this and that. And she was like, oh, no, I already did that. Just do what I did there and do it here. And I feel like Mrs. Roth did that. So here, historically, we actually had kind of a more neutral rug in this room, and the drapes behind me, instead of being yellow, these were actually a pineapple pattern, which a lot of people associate with Hawaii because that's where so many of the plantations are. Pineapples are, of course, not native to Hawaii, and it's a little bit of, it's been kind of overlaid onto traditional Hawaiian culture, even though pineapples really traditionally have nothing to do with Hawaii. In the modern kind of sense, people associate Hawaii with pineapples. And they did because of the colonial kind of onset onto the kingdom to grow them, especially in the modern period. And I know I've toured the plantation in Maui and tasted that amazing pineapple that grows there. But you know, at this point, mid-century, pineapple is still very much attached to people's sense of the island. And so the drapes in here were actually pineapple on big golden pineapples repeating in a pattern on cream drapes. And when you look at the family room in the house in Hawaii, the exact same drapes are hanging in that room. So I feel like she's like, no, I already made this decision. I'm good, just same fabric. Here's the sizes for these different size windows and everything else. And her house there was really amazing in that it opened, it was right on the beach, it was right next to a large resort. And she was basically invited to purchase the land right next door to this hotel, which was not one of her family hotels, it was a different hotel. And she was given, you know, that kind of inn, the society inn, about, hey, we would like to surround this part of the resort with society people to build these large, imposing estates that'll look amazing. And, you know, that's what our guests will get a sense that they're getting to visit and live amongst. And so she built this beautiful, very mid-century home with like the walls that all open up so that you get those beautiful breezes, but she's doing all the exact same things. So there's a bridge table. And most of our pictures of her in Hawaii are Mrs. Roth playing bridge. So all those kind of same activities are happening. She put in beautiful gardens there, you know, but they just tend to like kind of drift into the natural landscape down to the cliff edge and the waves crashing right below her porch there, which was just really stunning. So Hawaii definitely was a big part of the 60s for her. And I've always sort of loved the fact that she went and sort of did that recoup thing for herself. And that house stayed in the family until maybe in the last 10 to 15 years. Bren had purchased it from her mother before she died, and then Bren's family sold it. So it remained a part of their family for many years to come.
Julie, we have a question. Did you say that the estate was on the Big Island?
I want to say
where?
the island, and I'm completely blanking on what it was called, which is so embarrassing, but I'm completely having a moment on what it was. And they had a lot of operations on the Big Island, and their hotels were on, you know, Waikiki. That's where a lot of the initial hotels were. And they built the different hotels spread out over the decades. So you kind of, after the war, you have the next two be built. Because during the wartime, you know, Matson was basically taken over by the war effort. So their hotels were opened up to soldiers. You know, when we were in the kitchen, we were talking about the fact that one of the submarine crews was basically given like leave at their hotel, a chance to recoup after all the stress of going back and forth in the Pacific and looking for submarines during the war. And so after the war, they did millions of dollars worth of rehab and kind of refreshing all of the hotels to go into this next generation. And then they end up selling them at the end of the 50s. But I'm having a complete moment. I might let my brain percolate in the background if I can come up with where her other house was. It'll come to me.
Have you seen pictures of the gardens? Were they were they English garden style, sort of along the lines of Filoli, or were they doing something that was more tropical? Do you know?
No, they're very tropical. The pictures that we have are beautiful, lush, a lot of tropical plants, that oversized ginger blossom, especially, that grows so prolifically in the garden, but a lot of big tropical. She definitely worked with what the local landscape was. She was quite a mid-century person. And I think we see Filoli, and when you look at the ladies of the house, Filoli is very much Agnes and William Bourne. And when you study both of them, they fit this mold in their aesthetic and their style. But when you really start looking at Bill and Lurleen, when they're here, this was their society location. This was their big place to host parties. But like Lurleen in her fashion, Lurleen in her style choices, the decorations that she chooses for inside the house, everything is super mid-century. She likes like big, bold, like that mid-century aesthetic and that modernist style, she really enjoyed. And it comes through in kind of everything that she does. They had a Georgian home in San Francisco before they came to Filoli, which today is the part of the Swedish consulate. They were there at one point. And it was a dual Georgian with her and her parents, like it backed up to each other so that they shared a courtyard behind the house together. But when you see kind of like what decoration she chose as the lady of the house, it's not surprising that we associate Lurleen so much with the garden, because that was where she made the most changes to the property. She was constantly adding camellias and rhododendrons and additional magnolias. Like the front of the house looks totally different from the Bourne era to the Roth era. The plantings dramatically change. You don't have the maples get put in, those extra magnolias get put in. And there's at least, a handful of stories of her and the gardeners getting into fights about camellias and whether or not they could fit anymore in the garden, and her waiting for the gardener's day off to then go to an underling and telling him, you put it there. And then being like, no, we were told there wasn't room. And she's like, no, right there. You can just put it right there. So she had a different idea as to like what you could really pack into that garden. But in the house, they had bought the house fully furnished and then had their own auction the year after. And what you see in that auction is you see a lot of the fussier things leave. And then in the pictures, a lot of the furniture remains constant, but it's the smaller travel mementos and things like that rotate, the kind of the tchotchke throughout the room that changes the most. And you see she has like a lot more heavy concentration of Asian and Southeast Asian art that comes into the house at that time, where the Bournes had it as much as they had the entire Grand Tour worth of decorations coming back with them. But you see more of the Pacific really concentrated during the Roth era. And that makes sense. Not only did she spend her entire childhood going back and forth to the islands when her father was captaining ships, but then later as back and forth as a passenger when they were traveling for work. And then there isn't a single year that you don't see them get on a cruise ship when it's their industry and go somewhere. So, almost every year they're departing. It's sort of the off years, maybe like one every 5 that you see them go across the country and take an Atlantic ship. Most of the time they're in the Pacific. And Bill Roth, helped develop Waikiki as a tourist destination. There was nothing there. Mrs. Coonan tells me, when before she left us, we had a video playing called Let's Go to Aloha Land. That was a Matson 40s bit of footage. And she said, oh yeah, that's when I learned how to do the hula on Waikiki Beach with like 5 people. And I know last time I was in Waikiki, there was 500,000 people everywhere, so there was just that development of the Pacific as a tourist destination, whether it was the Hawaiian Islands and then building their hotels there, because they really kind of quickly realized there's nowhere for our cruise ship guests to stay once they get there. Like we have to develop the next layer of entertainment. And so when you come and you watch the television in here, we've created basically a false little commercial that's based on Matson commercials that played at the time, but also we wanted to like push in some of that extra that you wouldn't necessarily know happened there. Like there was flower arranging classes that you could take at the hotel. You know, you would have the luau, yes. You would, you know, you had the beach, you had activities to go do. But the whole way that they communicated that to the public was different. The language is different. Even the tenor of the voice that's talking is different. It really is of that era. And so that's something that you'll see on the commercial. And then they were continuing to other locations throughout the Pacific. You know, their cruises went to Australia, to Tahiti, and they opened all of those kind of Pacific routes up for the White Line cruise ships to go to. And so you see her travel on all of those. Whenever there's a new line or a new destination opening up, you see them going out to do that. And it's through these years, and then kind of starting to get a little quieter for them on the travel side in this decade, in the 60s, when they're kind of focused again at home and getting that next generation to kind of launch like luxury liners. That's what they said when the girls had their debut ball in the 30s.
Julie, we have a few of our guests this evening who have Googled where Mrs. Roth's estate was. And so it was Mauna Kea Beach Resort. And they've also shared with me that it was a over 7,000 square foot living space. And the white sand beach was just 10 steps away from the main bedroom. Yeah. And it was built in 5 months' time, which was an amazing short period of time considering the import of all the large building materials. Oh yeah. So thank you, members, for helping Julie put that back in her head there. And then another question too about pink, which we do see pink in the house, and I guess there's a Royal Hawaiian pink, and wondering if that was a Roth influence.
Well, you know what's funny is the pink that we find throughout the house is actually from the Born era. And so that's a carryover. And today people kind of associate pink with being a more, traditionally feminine color, but that is actually a very kind of modern sentiment. You don't actually start to see that until the late 20s, early 30s. So when the color was being chosen here, it wasn't thought of as a feminine color. So even the walls in the gentleman's lounge that we were in last week, those have a fuchsia flower on the walls and a blue flower on the walls on a peach background as early as the teens. And Mrs. Roth kept that color when she came in. But where you see a little bit of the sensibility with Mrs. Roth is like at Christmas, if you recall, usually here on the coffee table in the study, we have her Murano Italian glass nativity scene. And they are traditional in that there's all the characters are present, but they're really like mid-century shaped and very stylized in that modernist glass design. Like the most realistic looking figure is probably the little baby Jesus that's a little clear with this little golden halo. But everybody else is like really blocked and formed off. And her decorations throughout the pictures always show she was very into mid-century. And when she moves out of here in 68, she moves into the house in Hillsborough. And the house on Bella Vista is like a mid-century modern, very open with plain white walls, very boxy, Japanese kind of soji screen doors that separate rooms, very modern. And she kept all of it very modern and then brought all of her favorite furniture here and put it into those rooms. And I gotta say, they look kind of strange in that environment. Like it's not what you expect to see the Georgian furniture. Like they just sort of blend more into this. But she had her own sensibility, and I think it comes through in like what she collects and what was important to her. And in patterns, tablecloths are like big, bold, blocky polka dot prints in the ballroom in the 60s. I think if you've been here at Christmas, you've likely seen one of the Duquette cacti. Should we call them cacti? They're spray painted. They're styrofoam cactus. They're spray painted silver or gold with like fake plants put into the end of them. Scream 60s. Very, very, very trendy for the time. And she did those kind of decorations throughout the house. So you definitely see like her style of the decade come through. And we always try to highlight that at the holidays. In this room, we use a lot of her historic ornaments that have passed down to us. And we put out, you know, her crushed sets, and she collected icons and things like that. So she liked to fill those spaces. You'll see a ton of her angels throughout the house, and they all are very mid-century, not traditional angels in that sense.
You can definitely see the influence with the Tony Duquette decor for the parties as well, right? Just the over the top bright colors, really of the era, right? Themed.
Yeah. Well, and Tony and his wife's name was Beagle, and they had moved up from LA, and he did all of her parties in this period. And he even did the parties at their golf club, you know, at the country club nearby. And he did over there, he did the undersea ball for them, where there was like shells and all sort of sea life hanging from the ceilings, and you came underneath and everything was shells. And I mean, Tony Duquette had some amazing personal mottos. You know, we know Filoli stands for Mr. Bourne's motto, but Tony Duquette had never fear being bored, or never fear being vulgar, only boring. And his most repeated one is more is more. So when he would do these decorations for her, he was like all in. I just want to show you, you know, exactly like just over the top. And he was an interesting artist for the time, because he liked to use found materials and he liked to use recycled materials, but then mimic traditional forms. So you'll see, and they were here on site for a couple of the parties in the 60s. He used hubcaps, chrome hubcaps, to make like Louis XIV style sunbursts that were like giant 6-foot standing suns that would be on display, but they're made out of chrome hubcaps and like recycled found materials. And that's where I think he loved the styrofoam. When you come through, you'll see one of his big flying ships in the reception room that's filled with flowers. And he made these out of wire and canvas. So he kind of made like a hard wire form in the form of a ship, and then he stretched canvas over it and then painted it blue and white to look like the porcelain. And they even have wings, like they're winged ships. And they were hanging from the ceilings in the tent. They were cruising across the bar tables where you picked up drinks and your punch bowl. You know, they were everywhere. And they're big. They're like almost 5 feet tall. They're giant ships. And he would do, you know, just pump out a whole bunch of those so that you could tie the whole party together, or do something really traditional like the portrait, which, you know, we have so many formal portraits. We have 2 portraits I'm looking at right now in this room. And he took that shape of like the 3/4 formal portrait view, you know, from the waist up, and he did big ornate antique frames, but then he did the entire flower. It's all flowers, like a mosaic of single blossoms put in to make these like formal ladies wearing headdresses, their gowns, everything is done in flowers. And those hung on the tents in the main courtyard during this party. So he was going crazy over the top doing these decorations for a very, you know, they were all kind of meant to be done and gone. The ships, you know, we only know of a couple of them that have survived. And this one came from Elena Grant a few years ago, one of the granddaughters.
It's so decadent. And speaking of decor, would you mind showing us, because we have a lot of new things on display in this room now that our members haven't seen yet. It would be fun if you could take us around for a little walk. And please, everyone, hopefully you've taken your Dramamine, your seasickness medicine, and we don't make you sick walking around. Julie, I know we'll go slowly. And I will ask for forgiveness Again, we're in the historic house, and so the signal might cut out, but just have patience, it'll come right back.
I know we played with all the different Wi-Fi in the house. Well, this is a really fun new addition this year. This was one of our COVID projects. Was, if you've recalled being in this room, you could almost never see what was actually on display in these bookcases because they were dark. There was no light. And so we had lighting installed inside of them. And at the moment, we're displaying Ms. Roth's traditional calabash and ceremonial bowls. And this is an amazing collection of Hawaiian materials and bowls that are here. The calabash gourd has been used by Native Hawaiians for centuries. And once their popularity, kind of caught on, they started making them out of other native woods like koa. And so you'll see quite a lot of them. And she collected these over the years. And when she passed away, she gave us her collection. And these, over the years, they've gone on loans to the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. They've gone out to other major institutions on loan. It's a really beautiful collection of them. And so we have them out on display here, and they're beautifully lit. And it's been a really special new addition to the room. We're also showing, their family portraits like we normally do. But you'll notice that none of the portraits are newer than the 1960s. So we didn't want to have you get immersed in this room and then look up and see the 2010s. So for many people, especially docents, let's see if I can get it where you won't see a glare on her face because of lighting. I might not be able to. But we actually have Mrs. Roth's portrait, her wedding portrait. So this is when she was still officially Lurleen Matson. And that's a beautiful Cronstedt portrait of her that was done in the early teens. And then we have, her husband's portrait, which was done after he died, actually. This one was painted posthumously. And that's unique. And the same painter that did that painting also did a number of important portraits, including the last Pope and Princess Diana. So he was quite well known for his portraits. And most of the time, he painted from life, clearly, but he did that one from a picture. So you kind of see we have the traditional family display in here. So when the sound is on, one of the things that you get to hear is that you actually get to hear Bill Roth making drinks. And you see the different drinks out on the table. Rest assured, these are all acrylic, so they can't spill and harm any of the furniture. And one of the things I love is this little bar. And I don't know if you've ever noticed when you were in here, but Mrs. Roth was really upset when they were talking about the paper that she wanted the horses to fit. But of course, because patterns repeat, you end up with like this same dark horse will repeat up top. But notice his head would have been chopped off, and she found that very disturbing. So she actually had them continue it up and onto the ceiling so that they wouldn't be severed. And it has its cute little general fridge in here and all of the accoutrements to make drinks. And I had a wonderful time sitting on the sofas in here with Mrs. Coonan some years back. I was always very grateful for her generosity of time. She would come and visit with me and tell me family stories. And we were sitting here on the sofa looking at family pictures, and she was telling me, wartime stories and how scary it was when, her husband, she wasn't sure if he was going to be found. He was lost when he was in the Army for a time, and she was staying here with her mother, and she was telling me this, and we were drifting kind of from one topic to the next. And I said, well, what was the family cocktail? Like, what were you drinking in here? Like, what was the go-to drink? And she said, oh, well, Jack Daniels. And her driver and her personal assistant was in the corner. And she said, well, some things don't change, Mrs. Coonan. And without missing a beat, I swear, she was so sharp. She goes, some things shouldn't. You know, she was just right on top of it. And she explained to me that at the time you were either a Jim or a Jack house. And Filoli was a Jack house because of, you know, Jack Daniels versus Jim Beam. And that there was a very fine line between the two, and that you only drank Jack Daniels in this room. So this television project was a fun one. We actually found it through auction, and it was in Virginia. And so in the middle of a quarantine, I was desperately trying to figure out how to get our new television shipped across the country. It took me about 3 weeks to find a private mover that basically like once a month goes back and forth across the country making deliveries of furniture. A very kind family that was able to like safely deliver it to my backyard with no contact, as we're getting so used to saying through all this. And it had it wasn't functional, but it did have, all the parts and everything. And so we actually gutted the television. I ripped out all the innards and I hacksawed off all the brackets in the back and everything and glued all of the little knobs. So it really does have, all of those the dials and the controls that you'd expect to see at the time are all there. But of course, when you take out the machine from behind, those all want to fall out because they're no longer attached to anything. So I had to like glue them all and make new foam backers and then fit a new flat screen television into the gap and refinish the case in my dining room. So it was a very fun project. It was keeping me busy, and it's turned out great. And we're very excited to finally kind of have it in its historical spot. We have one of our Buddhas and some other mats and cards and things like that out. There's the appropriate level of ashtrays in the room now. That is also a part of our history that we haven't always talked about is everybody smoked at this era in the house, and there's not a single picture of the house that doesn't have like 10 ashtrays in it. They're on every single surface. And so that's sort of what we've put back into the space here. But we even have, like one of the Matson lighters, and we have a mix from like these Bakelite coasters to a mix of both. There's some Matson and crystal cut ashtrays throughout the space. We also have the bridge game being played over here. We have the special Filoli bridge pads that are left over from the games of bridge in the tournaments that used to be played here on site. And so that's been really fun. And things, like there's a fun story that goes along with this Matson image. Most people, have sort of missed it over the years. But this is a piece of basically like, a collage art that was made and being sold in the tourist market in the islands. And Bill Roth, the son, went on his honeymoon to Hawaii and he found this. And he thought it was just really fun that it had, his family history built into this, like kind of just the general tourist art. And he bought it for his mother and he gave it to her as a gift when they got back from their honeymoon. And she kept it for all those years. And it was one of the pieces that she gave to us in her 1985 bequest.
And so I have a question too about the carpet we just saw briefly.
Oh, yeah.
And it looks like it has pineapples on it.
It does. So this is one of those things. I've had a few moments of just true luck in working on projects in the house over the years. So one of the things was this rug. The rug that was originally in here did stay with the house, and this room is about 20 feet by 24 feet. It's close to a square, but not quite. And it had about a 16-foot rug that was in the middle of it. And that rug had been damaged before I came, and so it wasn't here. And so this was one of the few rooms on the main part of the house that didn't have a large kind of formally fit rug. And one of the early visits I had with Mrs. Coonan, we walked into this room together. We used to do these kind of walking oral history tours, and I recorded them. So I love going back and listening to them. And we've been transcribing some of them recently. And we would walk and talk, and we walked into this room, and she goes, "Julie, you have to get a proper size rug." And I said, "Well, I explained to her that the rug that her family had left had become worn, and it wore all the way through, and it had a rather large hole in the middle of it," was what Tom Rogers had told me, and that we didn't have it to put out on display anymore. And she says, "Well, there's 3 rugs down there right now." And I said, "Well, I chose the 3, best rugs that I had, and I sort of cobbled together like a formal look for the room." So there was one underneath her table, there was one underneath the sitting area, there was one underneath the bridge area. And she looked at me and she goes, "It looks like we couldn't afford a proper rug." You have to get a proper rug. And so I kind of said, all right, I will look for one. And the next day, a cold call came in for a donation, and they said, "We have a rug, and it's a pineapple chain rug, and we wonder whether or not you would be interested in it." I said, well, what size is it? And they said, "It's 16 foot square." And I said, "Well, what color is it?" And they said, "It's sort of gold." And I went, "Can you send me a picture?" Because it's either going to be perfect or it's going to be a terrible kind of gold on gold nightmare. And when the picture came through, I said, "Well, I definitely am interested in it. This is a Spanish rug that's an early 20th century rug. And it's the perfect shade of gold for these upholstered sofas and the upholstered drapes."
I do have a question from one of our members about the safe. We have the door closed, but would you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the safe is right behind me. It's behind this shoulder, right behind the Captain Madsen's portrait. I closed it tonight only because with this view as our primary view, it was sort of like a big black cavern behind me. But it's meant to be hidden behind, the jib door, as they're called, so that you don't see them. They're meant to disappear into the trim as much as possible. And they're all throughout Filoli. You'll see them here with the bar and with the safe, and you'll see one in the drawing room, but every single bedroom upstairs, the closet and the bathroom door are both jib doors. And it's so that it doesn't throw off the balance of the room. You wouldn't want to have those as framed outdoors because it takes away from the structural importance of the fireplace facade.
Corinne is asking if you discuss the Phoenix.
The Phoenix are really fun. So they're porcelain, and they're actually one of the better examples of them that I've seen. These ones are said to be 19th century, and they're hollow porcelain, and then they're glazed to give you the color. So you see one of them right behind my shoulder here, and they're a pair, but they're not identical. They're meant to complement each other. And they were a piece that Mrs. Roth brought back to us in the early 80s. The house was pretty cleaned out when she moved out. Very, very little remained. And she was one of our biggest donors in the early years. And then with her bequest, she sent back about 80 lots or so of items. And these came back before she passed away. Tom Rogers, our past curator, told me he met her at the front door, and she was walking down the front courtyard. She had one by either neck, and she was carrying them down, and she kind of thrust them at him and said, "These were always in the study, and we've put them back into their historical spot in the study." So I mean, she was a real character, very, very down to earth. There wasn't in all of the things, she was always very gracious and seemed to be, easy to approach. And Tom found her very generous with her stories, the same way that her daughters were generous with stories and passing those things along.
We're so lucky to have those pieces from the second family that made Filoli home, that really make this room part of this era that we're talking about tonight. And I can just picture Mrs. Coonan was a little thing, so she and her twin sister. So those were a handful, I'm sure, for her to pass on to Tom. But I want to thank you, Julie, for this series. This has been so much fun for us to do together.
Thank you for being a wonderful hostess and doing all the hard work behind the scenes to make sure that we all have our recipe and an invitation and doing all the early tests with me and everything. So thank you for making it happen.
We're grateful so much for your support and for you being there for us. And we will do our best to be there for you in every way we can as well. So check out our website. We have more virtual content there. We have some lovely tours of the gardens and the house on our YouTube page. You can, I'll switch my view here so you can see it better. You can get these virtual backgrounds to use with all of your Zoom meetings. I'm in the drawing room, but we've got the ballroom and tulips in the garden and other fun spots as well. There's one of the study as well. So you can download those and use them yourselves. And always consider a gift membership for a loved one or your hero or your friend for their birthday. It's a great gift that I think everyone can appreciate. So thank you so much for being with us tonight, and cheers.
Cheers. Take care. Hope to see you soon.